Hi, my name is Jeen Ha. I'll be presenting South Korean public value co-production for AI for humanity, a synergy of sociocultural norms and multi-stakeholder deliberation, and bridging the design and implementation of national AI ethics guidelines. I was a US Fulbright student last year in 2021 in Korea, where this research was conducted, and my host affiliation was the Korea Advanced Institute for Science and Technology, KAIST for short. So for the introduction, uh, a good question we can keep in mind is, can AI ethics design and implementation be thought of as a continuous process rather than a process partitioned into matters of theory and practice respectively? So as a visual, instead of understanding, let's say, designing AI ethics and implementing AI ethics as different stages that need to be checked off on a checklist per se and be put aside, it'd be interesting to conceptualize the two as part of an ongoing, continuous, publicly involved dialogue that's facilitated by an underlying foundational mechanism or platform. And we will see an example of this in the upcoming slides. So to introduce the subject of our discussion today, what is a democratic global ICT leader with a people-first philosophy, thanks to the most recent administration, supported by a synergy of ICT and multi-stakeholder engagement, as we can see in the country's response to the COVID-19 pandemic in the past few years, catered to its own sociocultural context, doing with respect to this question. And at this intersection is South Korea. So the focus point of this paper is South Korea and its development for national guidelines for AI ethics, or in Korean, 국가인공지능윤리 기준. Hereafter, I'll refer to South Korea as Korea for short and the guidelines as guidelines for short. The main three research questions involved were: one, what are the public values that were highlighted by the guidelines? Two, how may such values reflect prevalent Korean social cultural norms, if any? Three, how have these values been negotiated in a democratic public sphere to be incorporated into the guidelines and be prepared for implementation in a way made possible by Korean policy making? The methodology was using a descriptive qualitative case study grounded in document-based research, as well as qualitative interviews. So official government reports and publications and public hearings were consulted, media articles were read. Like I said, 9 interviews were conducted with members from the 4 stakeholder groups involved in the multi-stakeholder process for the guidelines. So that is government, industry, academia, and citizen groups. There's a 3-part literature review, so I'll briefly go through it in the paper. First part was bridging theory and practice in AI ethics. So many scholars have addressed this in previous years in recent AI ethics scholarship. The main question being, how should relevant institutions and stakeholders translate the theory underlying AI ethics principles, guidelines, and or codes into practice, i.e. technical and legal mechanisms? So a number of scholars, including Floridi in 2019 and onward, with other co-authors, Whittlestone et al. In 2019, Orley et al. 2020, 2021, and so many more, just to frame the relevance of the case study in Korea to AI ethics and AI ethics scholarship. The second part being a discussion of public value, its origins, its definitions over the years, and its relevance to the case study, again, to inform our understanding of what happened in Korea with respect to the guidelines. Just briefly, Mark Moore in 1995 first introduced the concept of public value as he raised the question of how public executives and administrators and officials should contribute to the well-being of overall society, should contribute value through their roles. And so there were many derivative definitions, but I chose 3 just because they were more relevant, I think. Many scholars chose to understand public value as public value singular, a more abstract concept, how to create public value for the benefit of society, versus public values, plural, what public values were negotiated, let's say, in this policymaking process, i.e., or e.g., equality, equity, security, so on and so forth. Bennington and Stoker here were more concerned with public value singular. In the abstract, Bozeman was more focused on public values, plural. So it shows in their definitions. Bennington says public value is part of a deliberative process where conflicting interests and values must be negotiated through to achieve a consensus. Stoker talks about networks of deliberation and delivery, focusing on how stakeholders are involved in interdependent relationships. Bozeman focuses on public values as those providing normative consensus. And so I consolidated these three definitions into a joint definition that is created via networks of diverse stakeholders whose conflicting interests and normative public values are debated and negotiated through emphasis on continued deliberation and pursuit of public value within, again, a democratic public sphere, emphasis on that. And the third part of literature review was a brief overview of the sociocultural and political context for Korea. So Korean social norms are highly influenced and informed by Confucian ethics. The three bonds, or samgang, are a part of that, where there are three relationships, hierarchical ones, that theoretically dictate the dynamics within Korean society. So one is ruler-subject, subject respects the ruler. Second, the son respects the father. Third, the wife respects the husband. And while there can be critique for this cultural dynamic, this paper serves a more descriptive role than an evaluative one. So I'll leave critiques to future research and investigation, but I recognize that they can indeed exist and should be pursued if there is merit to them. And then furthermore, Korean traditional socio-political model has been Confucian, so the characteristics seen are state leadership, hierarchy, and collectivism. And these are interesting to note as we move forward into the case study. And just for historical context, after Korea became a constitutional democracy in 1987, top-down policymaking elements of the Confucian influence, as well as a more multi-stakeholder model, can be seen over the years. The Roe administration in 2003 to 2008 really emphasized and brought to life the state plus civil society relationship, where the civil society had a more integral part in policymaking. And not so much in the following years until 2017 to 2022, the Moon administration really brought it back to life again, especially in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we see a lot of public-private partnerships and engagement with civil society. And this is a note that touches more on what I said earlier as a caveat. And just to go into the background before going into the case study, this timeline highlights several events that really show the progression of Korea's involvement in AI. Well, first for AI, and then AI ethics. Just to point out a few, in August 2017, President Moon, after becoming president in early 2017, establishes the PCFIR, the Presidential Committee for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, really hitting the ground running, saying Korea is going to become a leader in 4IR, and we're going to really create state-led initiatives to make that happen. And then 2017, 2018, Korea becomes involved on an international scale with OECD and its development of AI principles, ethical principles. Korea showcases its ICT capabilities and public-private partnerships within that realm through the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018 February. 2018 and 2019 AI ethics charters were developed intranationally in Korea, and an instrumentalist attitude can be detected within those charters, according to a number of scholars, where Korean society tends to view AI really as a tool, and that humanity should be prioritized. Human rights should be prioritized over the capabilities and potential capabilities of AI. And then in 2019, national strategies, policies, initiatives were further established until December 2020, when the guidelines, the topic of case study, actually became released for public viewing. And in 2021, early 2021, a chatbot similar to Microsoft's Tay sparks controversy within Korean society, raising the question of the importance of AI ethics within Korean society. And for case study, we're going to focus on this part of the timeline where AI ethics charters were developed internationally, all the way to the guidelines release. For the case study, there's yet another timeline. Just to go through it briefly, in 2019, when the AI ethics charters were developed intranationally, the Korean government concurrently, under the Moon administration, tasked the Ministry of Science and ICT, as well as government-affiliated research institute KISD, to act as mediators for a multi-stakeholder deliberative process concerning the guidelines. A working group of legal, ethics, and education scholars first developed a theoretical framework to serve as a springboard for multi-stakeholder discussion in April of 2020. Drafts were created. 70 experts from the 4 stakeholder groups were invited to provide their opinion via online discussion platforms and the surveys that continued. Public opinion was collected, public hearings were had until the guidelines released in December 2020. So that could arguably mark the end of the design phase, but it didn't end there. The implementation phase immediately began in 2021 as legislative hearings, policy seminars, and ethics checklists were held and developed, and it's a continuous process. Again, just looking at this timeline, it's evident that the multi-stakeholder engagement process and platform created initially during the design phase was carried all the way through into the implementation phase. And the Korean government itself, along with KISD, the Research Institute, highly emphasized this element of AI ethics development. So the guidelines themselves, theme AI for humanity, humanity prioritizing is connoted by the theme itself. There are 3 main principles, Hande Wonchik, reminiscent of the 3 bonds. So we can see that Confucian influence there. The 10 key requirements stem from the 3 main principles, from human rights all the way to safety and transparency. These definitions, these principles and requirements definitions are still in constant debate and discussion through the ethics checklist, through the legislative hearings and policy seminars. So for an example of what happened during the development process of the guidelines, just as an example, a fundamental change was highly recommended among the 4 stakeholder groups via constant deliberation that the working group's more traditional Confucian-laden value framework should be changed to a linguistically more modern and easily accessible framework. So the public values present here are not only public good, as evident from the AI for humanity theme. What does it mean to have humanity or AI for public good, but also accessibility. So keeping in mind that global, international, and intergenerational dynamic, the public value dilemma involved was accessibility versus a lack thereof. So is Korea going to preserve traditional cultural norms, or is it going to cater more to an international audience, an intergenerational audience, which has greater priority? And the negotiation involved was essentially a compromise to simplify the potentially esoteric 3 bonds to keeping just their bare-bone structure and hierarchical essence, so that instrumentalist attitude where humanity is prioritized without sacrificing comprehensibility. So we have an interfusion of Confucian ethics, instrumentalist attitudes, as well as an interplay between academia, industry, and civil society groups. So for the discussion, from a public value perspective, this case study shows how particular social cultural norms and values inform design and implementation of AI ethics principles. Korea in particular has a state-driven multi-stakeholder policymaking approach, so it can be seen as one continuous system via public policymaking. And while Korea's case is but one example, its context-specific participatory multidisciplinary deliberative process can serve as a useful comparative model for other countries, especially those who want to also pursue a publicly engaging means of developing AI ethics. And I think Korea can serve as a leader in providing a model for AI ethics itself, although it really posits itself as a leader for 4IR and AI. So it'd be nice to see more international level discussions open up and lessons to be learned through this case study. So these are some references from previous slides. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will be open to comments, suggestions, and thoughts. Thank you.